But I realize now, one thing feels certain. As I type this out, it feels so clear. I've typed this very sentence before. Just now, this too. I went back, and now I'm here again. This story, these words, I just wrote this. I just wrote this before, and now, just now, I'm writing this again. I'm certain. These words, I'm certain I've written them before. Warning, do not go outdoors if you have a headache. There will be no emergency alert from the government. This post is all you have, and you must read it immediately. It'll vanish soon. On Monday, the 10th of February, half of my town's inhabitants woke to find themselves afflicted with a headache, and we treated it as a commonplace outbreak of the winter flu, much like the ever-elusive snow day. The town cold is a one per annum staple of the season in both cases. Adults despair, and opportunistic school children treasure that day off school. My point is that an outbreak of the flu is nothing out of the ordinary in our town. But this isn't the flu, and it isn't confined to this town, it's everywhere. The headache's consequential phenomenon, which began on Tuesday, the 11th of February, made both of those things painfully clear. We should have known. Nobody felt as if they had the flu. There were no congested noses. No spluttering coughs, not even a stray sneeze, only headaches. The mystery of the town headache was a hot topic. In the local eatery, on the morning commute, and even at work. One bus passenger jested that the smarmy mayor's opulent kitchen setup, which features a whopping 10 stoves, might have leaked enough carbon monoxide to poison the entire town. And two of my colleagues had a particularly unsettling conversation about the supposed sickness. Stephen said, "I've had migraines before, but this is something else. Even my ears are throbbing. I'm half convinced that my brain is about to slip out of them. Do you think something's going around?" Asked Paul, "I suppose, but it's curious that we only have headaches," Stephen replied. Paul shrugged. "Well, that's how it always starts. I'm sure we'll see more symptoms tomorrow." We did. I was woken, around 6 on Tuesday morning, by a barbed screech from the street. It was agonizingly melodic, much like the second voice, which accompanied it 10 seconds later a baritone yell to bottom out the soprano shriek. Both sounds somehow drowned out the roar of torrential downpour. The rainfall hadn't been enough to wake me before my morning alarm, but the screams certainly did. I had the overwhelming urge to stay in bed to do anything but draw back the curtains covering my bedroom window. There are no words to encapsulate my dread, weighty and doughy. It stuck to the walls of my gut, threatening never to let go, not until I had an answer, at least. But that was a lie. Dread gave way to horror when I opened the drapes to gaze at my rainy cul-de-sac. On the other side of the road, watched by their blubbering son on the front lawn, were two sing-song shriekers, Mer and Mrs. Cowley. They were rising into the air. It seemed, impossibly, as if the fundamental laws of physics had turned a blind eye. Made an exception. My neighbors were ascending, rocketing upwards, flailing their arms and legs fearfully as the ground drove away from them. The harder they tried to swim back down to the dirt, the faster some higher power seemed to pull them away. I blinked disbelievingly, hoping that the scene outside my window would change once I'd cleaned the gunk from my eyes. I hoped that a saner version of reality would reveal itself. But it was no trick, no illusion. When I opened my eyes, Mr. and Mrs. Cowley had risen higher still, and their forms, unfastened from earthly forces, showed no sign of slowing. They had climbed higher than the houses of our town, floating away from the soil, and their crying son those two wet, mushy messes below. The Cowleys' mouths were hanging wide open to unleash those hauntingly melodic notes, one low, the other high, and as they started to claw their hands at their gaping jaws, I considered something horrifying, that their bodies were disobeying not only the laws of gravity, but any conscious commands to stop the screaming, and that something else might be conducting their vocal cords to produce those musical notes. Then my own scream loudened as I noted more bodies in the distance, rising like Mr. and Mrs. Cowley, floating upwards from adjacent residential streets and disappearing into the clouds, never coming down for a few minutes. During that inceptive period, social media posts flourished. There was evidence of the phenomenon. Online, not just here, but in countries across the world. Minor incidents in minor places, perhaps. But it was a global event. You have to believe me. People began floating upwards, and within a matter of 5 minutes, they had disappeared beyond the clouds, much like their choral symphony of terror. Every ascending person reported a headache the day before by 6:10 a.m. Shortly after the bodies had vanished, posts vanished, 2 posters vanished. I know how it sounds, but you'll find no tinfoil hat on my swollen head. It's real. It happened. The Cowley boy has been standing on the lawn and crying all day. Nobody's gone to help him. I think we're all those of us who remain too afraid to go outside. And I know it's going to happen again. My head has started throbbing. It is a feeling like no other. The pain, I mean. The headache comes with a persistent pressure, cracks, sound in my head, speckles skitter across my eyes, my brain balloons. Would it be more terrifying to float off into space, with no way of binding oneself back to Earth, or to float into some supernatural abyss? Could this be the rapture itself? I don't know what happened to the ascenders, you see. But I will soon. I've been staring out of my window for hours, and my eyes sting. I don't think I've blinked in that time. I yearn for the outdoors. I yearn to be outside. But enough of my mind remains that I have the wisdom to post this warning. If you have a headache, stay home. Don't bother posting about your experience. Until the phenomenon hits major cities, I think any evidence will be suppressed, easily discounted as a lie, given that this is happening in such small places. But you'll know the truth soon enough. Hopefully, you'll only see it, you won't feel it behind your eyes as I do. But if you do feel your head pound, and you live with someone, then beg that safe person to tie you down. You won't be able to resist the call. I'm terrified. My mouth is twitching, and I feel a murmur building at the back of my throat. Soon, I'll see what waits above the clouds. It wasn't a city anymore. It was a thing waking up. I swallowed hard. That's new. The dog sighed. Not really. The ground trembled beneath us. I took a step back. We should go. The dog didn't move. He just kept watching, as the thing, whatever it was, kept piecing itself together, like a puzzle no one should have finished. Hey, I said, nudging him with my boot. You coming or not? He blinked up at me, his expression unreadable. Then he stood, shook out his fur, and trotted forward. Still Tuesday, he muttered. And the city fucking grinned. Woke up on a Tuesday and everything was wrong. At first, I thought it was just me. Maybe I was having a stroke. Maybe I'd hit my head in my sleep. But then I rolled out of bed and hit the ceiling, which wasn't the ceiling anymore. It was just a direction. I hung there for a second, my brain doing whatever the opposite of processing is. Then I fell again, sideways, this time, then up, then in a direction that shouldn't exist. Like some cruel god had invented a new axis just to mess with me. I landed in my bathroom sink. The faucet sighed audibly. I tried to stand, but my legs had other plans. One of them bent forward, one bent backward. And neither of those were things they were supposed to do. Okay, I whispered. Cool, normal. Love this for me. I crawled to the window and looked outside. Bad idea. The street had turned into an ocean of static, and floating chunks of sidewalk drifted like icebergs. A man stood on one of them, making a peanut butter sandwich that kept changing ingredients. Every time he blinked. Buildings flickered between dimensions. Some were upside down. Some were perfectly fine. One was on fire, but the flames were cold. In the distance, the sky was loading, like a bad internet connection. Half of it was still the normal blue I remembered, but the other half was just a placeholder. Image of a sky, complete with watermarks. The laws of reality weren't just broken. They had quit entirely. Behind me, something cleared its throat. I turned around, and there, sitting on my bed like this was any other day, was a golden retriever. He wagged his tail. Mornin'. I stared. He licked his paw. You look confused. I continued staring. He tilted his head. You know, most people would have said something by now. I made a noise, not words, just a noise. He sighed. Fine, I'll start. Name's Toby. Everything's fucked. We should probably leave before things get extra fucked. Any questions? I blinked. You're a dog. Excellent observation, genius. Wanna try for a second sentence? I rubbed my temples. which felt fuzzy, like my brain was being auto-corrected in real time. What is happening? Toby hopped off the bed and stretched, his back elongated 3 extra feet, then snapped back like nothing had happened. Short version: reality is having a meltdown. Long version: reality is having a meltdown, and you're in it. Okay. Cool. Great. I nodded, ignoring the fact that my head was now on a slight time delay. How do we fix it? Toby laughed. Oh, buddy. We don't. I stared at him. He stared back, tongue hanging out, like this was funny to him. All right, I said, forcing a deep breath. Okay. Then what do we do? He turned toward my bedroom door and kicked it open telepathically. We go shopping. Before I could question what that meant, my door swung open to reveal a grocery store, right where my hallway used to be. Fluorescent lights flickered overhead. Aisles stretched into infinity. Some were perfectly normal. Others were not. One was stocked with bottled screams. Another had cans of pure regret, labeled now with 20% more. Yeah, no, I don't think I want to go in there, I muttered. Toby grinned, his teeth multiplying in real time. Too bad, buddy. We need supplies. I took a step backward. The floor disagreed with me. Then everything tilted, and I was falling forward, straight into the unnatural void of consumerism. The last thing I saw before I hit the linoleum was a sign that read, "Buy one, get a free memory of a childhood you never had." Then I hit the ground, and the world rearranged itself around me. I killed my best friend last week. Now he's acting like nothing happened. That is dead, I thought, finally realizing. Stood over his body. What am I going to do? And truth was, I had no idea. Murder was a serious charge. I'd watched those true crime documentaries. I knew how this worked. The killer always gets caught, no matter what. God, I'm a killer. I looked around. We were in a small clearing in the woods east from my house, woods that nobody ever went into, which was partly why we did. It was so that we could do whatever we wanted, you know. Stupid challenges, games, that sort of thing. Stuff for laughs. But I wasn't laughing, and Josh certainly wasn't either. I looked back down at his body. It was awful. His clothes were torn and tattered, and his face was split open in an awful way. Down the left side of his head. You'd have to squint hard if you even wanted to lie to yourself that it looked anything remotely human. I felt another pang of adrenaline. I need to be smart. I need to make this go away. I have to. I moved over to my left. There was a ditch. Here, about 2 meters deep, shallow on one side but rocky on the other. I looked back behind me towards Josh's bike and started to piece a story together. Maybe, I thought, maybe he was riding his bike down here. He got distracted by something. Maybe he went into these sharp rocks. Along the shallow side of the ditch, there was a bit where the rim turned upwards, like a ramp. Okay, he went along here, this ramp. Got distracted. Hit the rocks. It was the only thing I could think of. Maybe the sharp rocks slid his face like that. It might be a little far-fetched, but it was the best I could think of. I took a deep breath and lifted Josh. He was heavier than I thought, and I almost slipped in the wet dirt as I hoisted him over my shoulder and carefully placed him in the ditch. I tried to make it look like he was crawling away. He probably wouldn't have died straight away, satisfied with the placement of him. I turned my attention to the bike. It was still pristine, as me and him had just stopped and leaned them against a tree earlier on. That's not going to work, I thought. It needs to be bashed up more. I grabbed his bike and slowly rolled it down the mud in the path it would have gone, and then lifted it up and threw it across the ditch into the rocks. I picked it back up and did it again. That looks all right. I didn't pick it back up afterwards. It was already in a good spot, and probably would be more authentic if I didn't pose it. The last thing I did was take my jacket off, with all the blood on it, hoisted it under my arm, put it on the seat of my bike, and, after taking one last look back, rode back home. I left Josh there, and with him, a little bit of myself as well. I unlocked the front door of my house and hurried inside. I ran up to my room immediately and hid the coat under my bed. I'll figure out what to do with it later. I dulled my brain with a shooter game. barely paying attention. The rain outside was a small mercy, maybe it would wash some evidence away. My mom was coming back from work by now, and so I was now trying to act in higher spirits so nothing seemed too off. I guessed I probably had up until this evening before the police would be called. Josh usually lingered in town for a few hours after we hung out, and so it wasn't unusual for him to be home late. But he wouldn't come home today. I heard the key turn in the door. It made me jump. I got up and plastered a smile across my face and went to meet her at the front door. "Hello, Dan," she called from the hallway. "Hey, Mom," I said, lingering in the doorway, arms crossed. "Did you have fun with Josh today?" she said. Back turned to me, hanging her coat up her. Yeah, I did. Had to come home a bit early though. He said he needed to do something. Oh well, I'm sure it was important. Anyway, it's the holidays now. You could always hang out with him tomorrow. Yeah, I said, my smile slowly fading. When I went to bed that night, every time I closed my eyes, I could see that ditch etched into my mind. The mangled roots, the mangled bike, the mangled body. I got maybe half an hour of sleep before my alarm jolted me awake at 5 a.m. I immediately remembered Josh's face, twisted, warped, impossible. I felt like a stranger in my skin. The air was suffocating. The rooms in my house felt far larger than I'd ever noticed, and that they had any right to be, large and empty. Nothing felt right. I don't know how to describe it to you, because I can't even really understand it myself. But the thought of Josh's parents, sat there, worry building, waiting anxiously for a boy who would never come back, their only son, made me feel, I felt sick. I'm not sure if my mom had noticed that something was up. I mean, she must have. But I noticed her giving me weird looks for that entire morning, occasional glances. All of this pressure kept building and building and building and building to an almost unbearable level until, at about 1 in the afternoon, there was a knock on the door. My mom answered it, and as I sat there in the living room, head in my hands, I could hear what the man at the door was saying. It was muffled, but clear enough for me to hear parts of it. Yes, no, he didn't. His parents haven't seen him. If we could just, Dan, my mom said, opening the door and letting the man into the room. This man here just needs to ask you some questions. It's about Josh. I bottled everything down, swallowed, and then spoke as clearly as I could, maybe a little bit too quickly, but it was the best I could do. Josh. I looked away from my mum and now at the officer. He had a warm, kind facial expression, but with a tinge of unease and awkwardness. He was about to break the news. I'm not supposed to know yet. What's happened to him? I chuckled slightly. Has he gotten himself into some more? I trailed off. Listen, Dan. Josh hasn't been seen since yesterday morning. Now, we've spoken to his mother, and she says that she last saw him when he went out with you. Now, if that's true, this means that you might have been the last person to see him. I was staring at the name tag on his uniform. I didn't interpret it as letters, just shapes. I wasn't really focusing on it anyway. He shuffled in his seat slightly. Look, I know it's a lot to handle right now, and I understand that you two were close. But do you think that we could just ask you some questions? I told him that we went up into the woods, although I lied about where exactly. Then I said that after a little while of just chilling out, he'd gone further in, and I just turned around and gotten home. All the while, the officer was nodding comfortingly and never once changed facial expression from that slight smile. The smile that didn't reach the eyes. I suppose I was relieved, I guess, that I wasn't being taken in or arrested. In fact, I didn't get any sort of feeling that he even considered me a suspect. And I don't blame him. I don't have a history of anything. I never get into fights at school. I keep my head down. There's not a lot to go on there. And one kid in the woods on his own, anything could have happened. A murder, especially by the kid's best friend, probably wouldn't be high on the list of possibilities. After about half an hour, the officer left, saying he would keep us posted on the search effort, and that was that. Apart from the odd missing poster put up around town, there wasn't really much reminding me of Josh. I'd stopped riding my bike though. That at least was something that reminded me of that scene. But it was getting easier. I got rid of the jacket with all of the blood on it, and although the officers came back to the house a few times, I stuck to the same story, and after a few days they stopped. I felt like I could finally start moving on, at least dotting occasionally. I'd pass by the window of Josh's house on the way into town and see his mother sat, head in hands, and she'd give me that comforting smile, the same one that didn't quite reach the eyes, and I'd return it. And deep down, I didn't know if it was worse, that I had done the crime in the first place, or the fact that I was brushing it off so easily. However, this brief comfort ended about a week after the day I'd killed him, because after I'd hidden his mangled body in a ditch and lied to everyone I knew, I got a knock on the door, and as I peered through the window to check who it was, my blood ran cold. Josh was stood outside my front door, grinning. I just sort of stood there, like an idiot. It was him, of course it was. It was Josh, and somehow his face looked fine. It looked normal. His face was all back in place, and his clothes looked fine. He'd noticed me by this point. He waved to grab my attention and, with that grin still on his face, eagerly pointed towards the door, mouthing, "Let me in." I didn't know exactly what to think, but I found myself unlocking the front door, and there he was. The person I'd left muddied and bloodied in the woods stood about a meter away from me. Clean and healthy. He pushed past me without a word and walked in. "Hey, I thought we were going back out to the woods today." It took me a second to turn around and face him, to process what he had just said. "Josh, well, are we gonna go then?" He interrupted, still grinning, but with slight impatience. He pushed back past me into the garden before I even had a chance to say anything, and got on his bike that he had left leant against the front of my house. That clean, very much not battered bike. I rode next to him. It wasn't possible. It wasn't. I could still see his mangled face in my mind. It still haunted me. And now, it was all too much. It was supposed to be final. I'd convinced him to avoid the woods. He'd protested, but I was adamant. I didn't want to go back there anytime soon, and I wasn't sure what I'd find there anyway. He was still smiling. It hadn't fallen once since he'd arrived at my house, and it wasn't getting any less unsettling. We were riding now into town. He said we'd go and pick up some food, then sit down somewhere and just hang. I looked back at him again. He slowed to a stop. Look at that." I turned and faced the other way. He was pointing at one of those missing posters that his mother, only a few days ago, had plastered up on every pole or wall around town. "What about it?" My voice, hollowed, managed at least to blurt that out coherently enough. "Well, I dunno. It's weird how everyone thought I was missing for a week, right? Even my mom. It's not like her to forget." I furrowed my brow. Seeing that missing poster at least meant that I wasn't going crazy. But still, I had to be cuckoo somehow. I mean, she even called the police, if you can believe that. I grunted. "But it's okay," he continued. "I told her about what happened, and she phoned them saying it was all right." I noticed I was slowing down, so I caught back up to him as we rode further up our road, past his house. We both slowed as we approached the window. My eyes involuntarily drifted toward it. I looked, and after Josh waving, we both saw his mother grinning and waving back, her head moving between people to people. I stopped suddenly. He stopped too and looked at me in confusion. I tried to think about how to ask this. I didn't want to be too direct, but I still needed to know the truth. "Listen to Josh." I looked at him. He nodded. "What did you mean when you said your mom forgot?" He started chuckling and seemed to relax a bit. "Well, it's the funniest thing." He leaned in closer towards me. "She, somehow, doesn't remember driving me up to the camping spot last Tuesday. Isn't that mad?" I blurted in affirmation. "Tuesday. That was the day after I killed him." I pressed further. Do you remember what happened last Monday?" His grin stopped for a moment and then returned. "Well, come on, of course I remember. You do too, right? In the woods?" He chuckled and started writing again. I joined him, dumbfounded. I tried to push it to the back of my mind, as difficult as that was, and pretended everything was fine. We stopped off at the chip shop, picked some food up, and rode up to the park just as we would do often. It was really odd. It wasn't the fact he was back from the dead that freaked me out. It was the way he was acting. He was like this normally, stupidly positive, and before That was something that was good. Things were always fun with Josh. But now it was creeping me out. And the fact that he seemed to know what I did to him as well. Does he know I killed him? We sat and ate in silence. I couldn't think of anything to say. And he seemed to be perfectly content eating his chips, so I didn't feel a need to say anything. After a few minutes, he finally spoke. Asterisk. What have you been up to in the last week then, while I was gone? He paused, smiling. Camping. Camping, I found myself mutter. Yeah, of course. I messaged you last week about it. Don't tell me you're forgetting to. His teeth chomped down on another chip. I felt for my phone. I hadn't gotten a text from him. I knew that. I had spent the first few days after I'd killed him constantly rereading our last conversation. I unlocked my phone, Josh still happily eating, and navigated to our messages. I read our last conversation. It was on Sunday that I breathed a sigh of relief. It didn't happen. Josh stopped eating and looked at my phone. He grabbed it out of my hands. Why are you up here? He chortled. Look, you have to scroll down. You knob. He scrolled the chat down and then thrust the phone into my face. I read what it said. Monday, 12:10 p.m. Josh, Oi Dan, listen. I'm going camping tomorrow. Can't remember if I told you or Noti swallowed. I'd never seen that text before. He frowned suddenly and looked back at my phone. Oh, look, he said. I didn't scroll far enough. He fumbled with it for a second and then placed it into my hands. He turned away and continued eating. I looked and focused down at the phone. It was the most recent message, on Monday last week at 12:12 p.m. It said, Mate, why do you never invite me to these things, lol? Anyway, hope you have fun, bro. I chuckled nervously for a split second and then stopped myself. The text is from me. I looked at Josh, keeping eye contact with him while slowly turning my phone off and placing it into my pocket. He wiped his greasy hands on his jeans and smiled. You gonna eat any of yours? I hadn't even touched my portion. I looked around the park for a second. The only exit was in front of us, in front of the bench. I looked back at Josh. Yeah, listen. I sprang to my feet and got onto my bike. As I started pedaling, I shouted to him, You can finish them. I turned my attention back to what was in front of me. I knew where I needed to go. I could hear him calling my name, no doubt getting on his bike and chasing after me. But I knew what I needed to do and where I needed to go. But first of all, I had to lose him. As I left the park gates, I immediately turned left into an alley and then turned right. I continued straight ahead for a while before turning out back onto the main road. I was heading towards the woods. I slowed slightly and turned around. I couldn't see him. I didn't know how close he was, but he didn't have line of sight to me, which was something. I gritted my teeth and entered into the woods. I still remembered the route we went through that day. It wasn't a particularly difficult one, as it was mainly a straight line with a hard left turn, and the landmarks along the route were distinct enough for me to remember easily. And when I got there, my suspicions were confirmed. The body and the bike was still there, exactly as I left it. It was rotting now. I gagged and looked away. So what the fuck is the Josh I was just eating chips with? I didn't know what to do. I could point the body out to the police. That would work. An autopsy would say that the body was rotting for a week. That would prove that the Josh that was still alive was some kind of fake, but would they then realize that it was me? I didn't know what to do. I wanted to turn it and don't do that. I turned around. Josh was stood next to his bike, about maybe 10 meters away from me. He wasn't smiling anymore. How did you? What the fuck are you? I said, but he didn't answer. You're not going to tell the police anything, he said. I'll be back up here in a bit to sort all of this out. What are you? I repeated. You let me live my life and I'll let you live yours. We won't talk about this again. His voice was sounding oddly deep and raspy. Remember, it's what you did. I'll see you soon. But before I could respond, he was already far away. I regret participating in a deja vu study. Don't really want to get into why, but I lost my job and needed some quick cash. I've done various research studies and medical trials for cash before, so I thought it would be an easy way to get something to help hold me off until I could find another gig. I came across an ad for a medical study that paid surprisingly well, so I signed up without thinking too much of it. The building was huge, and I got turned around. The long, identical, white hallways all meshed together as one in my head as I tried to find room 312. I arrived late, but the staff was kind and understanding. I was told that this study was on déjà vu, and that full participation in this study required the insertion of a microchip into the brain. Look, I really didn't want a chip implanted in my head, but this study paid really well, and I needed the money. They told me that déjà vu was like a glitch in a particular area of the brain, which they had been able to isolate. Upon insertion, the chip would cause a constant, minor stress to that area of the brain, making déjà vu more likely to occur. All I had to do was record the details of what happened leading up to an episode of déjà vu that I experienced. That way, they could identify patterns and specific triggers, which they could then use to trigger an episode of déjà vu on me inside the lab. There, they could record and monitor the episode for their research. I signed the consent forms, and the procedure was done right then and there. It was a bit nerve-wracking to be awake while something went into my skull, but overall it was relatively quick and painless. I did, however, experience a dull ache at the insertion site afterwards, which was one of the side effects they had listed. The other possible side effects included nausea and insomnia, as well as phantom odors, minor confusion, and increased heart rate during an episode. So, I expected to have some side effects. I expected to have some minor confusion, but what I have experienced since then has gone so far beyond that I no longer know what to do. I'll start with my first episode, which was so tame in comparison to the others, but, at the time, really unsettled me. It was about a week after the insertion. I made my morning coffee the same way I do every single morning. I started up a pot of coffee, took the cream out of the fridge, and grabbed a mug. All while the coffee was brewing. The coffee finished brewing, so I picked up the pot and began to pour the coffee into my cup. That's when I felt it. It came on like a rush, as if I had just ridden a wave backwards in time and was reliving a recording of the moment that had passed only seconds ago. I know I pour my coffee the same exact way every morning, but this was different. I hadn't just poured my coffee like this before. I had lived this very moment. The rush wore off, and I was left in a kind of a daze, unlike any time I had experienced déjà vu in the past. My vision was fuzzy, and I was on autopilot as I poured the last bit of coffee into my mug. I picked up the mug and took a sip. It wasn't coffee. The unfamiliar taste caused me to snap out of my daze. My mug was filled with pure cream. Puzzled, I stared at it for some time as I tried to figure out what on earth had just happened. I know I wasn't paying full attention, but I so vividly remembered picking up the pot of coffee and pouring it into my mug. But when I looked back, the coffee pot was full and untouched. The cap to the cream sat on the counter, and the container of cream was half empty. They said minor confusion was a side effect that went along with an episode of déjà vu, but I started to pour my coffee before the déjà vu set in, so it just didn't make sense. It was unsettling, but I eventually accepted it, attempted to transfer the cream from my mug back into the container, and poured an actual cup of coffee. I convinced myself that it wasn't that big of a deal, which is something I now regret. The second time I felt déjà vu was 3 days later. I was in the bathroom brushing my teeth. Nothing out of the ordinary. It was as it always was when I brushed my teeth before bed. I didn't really think too much about what I was doing. My mind was wandering here and there in a few different directions, never fully focused on the actual act of brushing my teeth. But I was still conscious and aware. Of course, I have brushed my teeth in the same spot before. But when the rush of déjà vu hit me, I was certain that I had rewound time and was now reliving the same exact experience of brushing my teeth, the way I looked at myself in the mirror, the exact movements of the bristles sweeping across my teeth, side to side, up and down. The rush faded as I continued to brush, but my mouth tasted absolutely foul, bitter. It burned. It burned so badly, and I couldn't breathe. I stood over my kitchen sink, my heart beating violently as I desperately gasped for air, simultaneously. spitting out a gritty white foamy substance out of my mouth. I spat and spat, but it was still there. I released the death grip I hadn't even realized I had on my toothbrush and frantically reached for the faucet. I yanked the water on and shoved my head underneath, the water splashing both inside my mouth and all over my face. A powdery substance remained stuck to the insides of my molars, and I swished the water around aggressively in my mouth in an attempt to get rid of it fully. After several minutes of rinsing and swishing, I turned off the faucet and paused. Everything was quiet, aside from the occasional ping of the water dripping off of my face and into the metal sink. My mouth burned, and the foul taste lingered, but I was okay. My panic was subsiding, and I knew I was okay. The toothbrush I had previously had a death grip on was sitting next to the kitchen sink. It wasn't the toothbrush I had used to brush my teeth with regularly, but I recognized it. It was the toothbrush I kept underneath my sink to clean with, and for that, I used Comet, the powdered cleaner. This was more than just the unsettling feeling I experienced after the coffee and cream incident. This was chilling. My mouth was still burning, and I couldn't imagine what would have happened if I had swallowed accidentally. I threw up not too long after that, and that night, I hardly slept at all. I planned to call the research clinic as soon as they opened the following morning and have them remove the chip, but of course, the following morning when I called, the clinic was closed. Being unemployed can make you forget what day of the week it is, and that day, I found out, was Saturday. I didn't want to stay home, but I was too scared to leave. On that day, I watched TV I didn't eat, or even brush my teeth. On that day, I did not experience déjà vu. The following day, I couldn't bear to stay home. I was so afraid that I would be alone and something terrible would happen. These mundane tasks, I didn't want to do them. I didn't want to leave, but I forced myself to. I packed my things and went to the gym. I thought that maybe it would be harder to do something stupid while surrounded by so many people. My stomach growled on the drive there, but my mouth still burned. Parts, especially near my back molars, were completely raw. I packed my toothbrush, just in case, but I was too scared to brush my teeth again. I probably looked awful, but I didn't care. I hid inside of my baggy hoodie and baseball cap, despite being hungry and in pain. The workout actually boosted my spirits quite a bit. I felt much safer being around people. And despite feeling terrified that the déjà vu would hit again, for some reason I felt that I would rather it hit here. I worked my arms until they refused to move anymore, and then I went to the Stairmaster. I don't know how long I had been climbing the Stairmaster for before the rush hit me, but somehow it hit even stronger than it had the previous times. I felt with all my power that I had stepped on this machine in this exact way, precisely. At this exact same time, I had rewound my own timeline and was watching it play out. My vision blurred completely, but I continued to climb. I climbed, up and up and up. The rush wore off, and I was left in a similar weird daze. But still, I kept climbing, up and up and up. Only now the sound of my feet hitting the stairs sounded different. With every step I took, a metallic clang rang out. It was slippery. It was raining. I slipped and lost my balance. I was jolted out of my daze and instinctively grabbed at a metal post which connected the platform. I was onto a handrail. My hands gripped the wet, slippery metal post with what little strength I had left, while my legs dangled in the air about 100 feet up. I was hanging off the side of a fire escape, in the rain, trying desperately not to fall to my death. My fingers turned white as they gripped around the post, but they were sliding off. I was going to fall. I had the most intense boost of adrenaline I've ever had in my life, and somehow managed to pull myself up. My fingers slipped off the pole just as I had pulled myself up. Then I scrambled forwards frantically and clung on to the side of the building. I sat crouched in that position for quite some time. I don't know how long. I never calmed down, but I eventually gained enough courage to begin the climb down. This building looked old and possibly abandoned, and I had no idea how I had gotten there. I sat on the stairs, slowly and carefully lowering myself down one step at a time. I cried when my feet hit the pavement, and I saw my car parked on the street. I didn't know where I was, but it felt unsafe. There were several abandoned looking warehouse buildings. Bits of trash were being carried up by the wind and then beaten down by the rain, which was now coming down much more heavily than before. That my phone was sitting on the passenger seat. Although I don't know how it got there, never in my right mind would I leave it there, especially in an area like this. But I picked it up, typed in directions, and drove straight home, shaking and crying the entire time. I don't know how, but I managed to sleep. I woke up early the next morning and stared at my phone until the second it hit 8 o'clock, which was the time the research clinic opened. My desperation poured through into my voice as I begged the receptionist to let me come in today and get the chip removed. I explained that I was having very severe side effects and needed it removed immediately. She was hesitant, but scheduled me for a 3 p.m. appointment. I drove there straight after the phone call and waited in my car for hours. I wasn't going to take any chances. I went in at 2:30. I was sick of waiting. I broke down as soon as I walked into the waiting room. I felt so relieved to be here and finally get this thing removed. One of the nurses put her arm around me and guided me back to one of the patient rooms. She took my vitals and waited with me until the main clinician arrived. I remember feeling so grateful that she waited with me. I didn't want to be alone. I explained everything to the clinician. He had the audacity to try to convince me to keep the chip in, but I wasn't going to budge. Not after what happened. He explained that confusion was a common side effect, but I told him I didn't care. I told him his research wasn't as important as my life, and he reluctantly agreed to remove the chip. They prepared everything for the procedure, and I was placed in the exact same chair I sat in before when they made the insertion just last week. I sat there in that chair as the clinician spoke to me. He guided me through what he was doing. He told me he was going to make the incision, then said he was going to insert the metal rod used to remove the microchip. I sat as still as I could as the rod was slowly inserted into my head. I knew I had sat in that same chair before. I knew I had that same rod inserted into my head. But now I felt certain that this familiar feeling wasn't from the first insertion. It was from right then. I had already experienced the removal of the chip, and I was now reliving it. I screamed so loud that it made my own ears hurt, and then I went into a daze. Something painful struck my head. It struck again, this time more intense than before. The pain became unbearable as it pounded into my head, over and over, again and again in the same spot. My vision was completely blurred, and the smell of blood filled my nose. I snapped out of my daze and nearly vomited due to the pain. My eyes darted from side to side. I was afraid to move, but when I looked around, there was no one there. There were no lab assistants, no monitors, equipment, or tools. I was in a large, dark room. The walls had been torn apart, and water leaked through cracks in the ceiling. It was dark, damp, and smelled of mold. My head ached terribly, and I instinctively dropped what was in my hand to cover my head, which was bleeding all down my shirt. The clank of metal hit the concrete floor, and I looked down to see a long metal screwdriver covered in blood next to me. I was sitting in this old, run-down warehouse with blood pouring from my head and a screwdriver next to me. No one else was here. I had done this. I hardly remember leaving the warehouse. I had felt so paralyzed inside of there, but I eventually made it outside. My car was parked on the side of the road. It was parked in the same place as yesterday, when I had climbed the fire escape of the building that I now realize was the same building I had just been in. Again, my phone was on the passenger seat. I was bleeding profusely and not thinking clearly. I called an ambulance, but they never came. I called the clinic, but they didn't pick up. I called an ambulance again, but again they never came. I sat in my car for what felt like hours before giving up and driving home. I'm sitting in bed now, on my phone. I was scrolling for hours and finally decided to write this post. Maybe tomorrow I'll try to go to a hospital, but I'm just not sure of anything right now. I really don't know if I trust anyone to remove the chip, considering what just happened. The end came casual. The apocalypse started on a Tuesday. Not with fire, not with war, not with aliens blowing up the White House. Just weird shit. People woke up, and their reflections didn't match. Buildings stretched to high to thin, street. Signs whispered when you walked past, and some people just disappeared. Like, poof or gone. I should have known things were bad when I stepped outside, and the sky was the wrong color. It wasn't blue. It wasn't gray. It was I don't know. Like a color I'd never seen before, but somehow recognized. Like when you hear a song you don't remember but you know all the words. Anyway, that was day 1. By day 3, reality was drunk off its ass. Gravity started working on a freelance basis. Some people floated away like balloons. Others got stuck to the ground. The moon got way too close, like a nosy neighbor leaning over the fence. And the sun? Well, there were 2 of them now. By day 5, most people were either dead, missing, or existentially broken. Not me, though. I had a plan. Well, plan is a strong word. More like a stolen shopping cart, a backpack full of canned goods, and a gun I found on a priest. Listen, he wasn't using it. Probably. The important thing is I wasn't sticking around. See, there was a rumor going around. A safe place. A town that hadn't been touched by all this Willy Wonka acid trip bullshit. It was 500 miles east. So that's where I was headed. Just me, my cart, and the rapidly deteriorating rules of reality. And let me tell you, this road trip was gonna suck. Day 7, the trees started talking. Not like whispering creepy shit. Just small talk. The ocean was now inland and very, very angry about it. I found a dog. The dog spoke perfect English. He was also kind. Of an asshole. Day 10, met a guy with no face. He played the banjo. Pretty good, actually. The sun winked at me. I flipped it off. I think I hurt its feelings. The ground became water, but only when I wasn't looking at it. Dog stole my last can of beans. I will never forgive him. Day 15, ran into a cult. They worship a giant floating eye. The eye tried to recruit me. I told it to fuck off. I am now being hunted by an omniscient celestial entity. On the bright side, found a Snickers bar. Day 20, the road turned into a Mobius strip. I walked for 3 days before realizing I was going in a loop. The Snickers bar had a pulse. I ate it anyway. Reality started cracking. Literally, there are holes in the world. I looked into one. Something looked back. By day 25, I was starting to enjoy myself. I mean, sure, existence was breaking down like a shitty bootleg DVD. But at this point, I'd seen so much mind-melting horror that I was kind of numb to it. So when I finally reached the safe place, I wasn't even surprised that it was worse. See, everyone was fine here. To find no monsters, no sky meltdowns, no whispering shadows, just people, smiling. Perfect. To perfect. I watched a woman burn her hand on a stove. No reaction. No flinch. Just a big, frozen smile. I watched a man get hit by a car. He got back up. Bones twisted wrong, and kept walking like nothing happened. Then a kid ran up to me. Big, dead eyes. He grabbed my hand, and his fingers kept going, stretching, wrapping around my wrist like rope. He leaned in close. You don't belong here. I yanked away. Heart hammering. The whole town was staring at me now, still smiling, still wrong. And that's when I realized this wasn't a safe place. This was where reality went to die. And I had just walked right in. It was a Tuesday, but only because the dog said so. I wouldn't have known otherwise. The sky hadn't changed in weeks, stuck in a dull, sunburnt haze. Like the world had been left in the oven too long and someone had forgotten the timer. Clocks still worked, but time didn't mean shit anymore. Days slurred together like a drunk at last call. It was easier to let the dog keep track. I glanced down. You sure? The dog trotted beside me, tongue lolling, tail flicking. He looked like any other stray short blonde fur, a little too thin. Eyes way too intelligent for something that still ate its own puke. He nodded. It's Tuesday. Dumbass, fair enough. I kept walking. We were in a city, or at least, the corpse of one. The buildings still stood, but not in any way that suggested they wanted to. It was like they'd given up, slouching against each other, hollowed out and waiting for something to finish the job. Cars sat abandoned in the streets, rusting and half melted, like someone had parked them in a microwave and hit popcorn. The wind pushed scraps of paper along the asphalt, whispering secrets to no one. I was looking for water. Again. The dog patted ahead, sniffing at the air. You smell anything useful? I asked. I smell rot. I smell rust. I smell your shitty attitude. So, nothing useful, not yet. I sighed and adjusted my bag. It was lighter than I wanted it to be. The last water bottle was half full, maybe less, but optimism was important. Something groaned in the distance, a low, warped sound, like metal being twisted apart. I tensed. That normal? The dog flicked an ear. Define normal. Normal as in, do I need to start running? The dog sat down, scratched behind one ear with his back leg. Not yet. The wind shifted. The buildings leaned. Just a little. A ripple passed through the concrete, like the whole city had just woken up from a bad dream. I froze. The fuck was that? The dog sighed. It's waking up. I turned to him. What is? The buildings groaned again, the pavement under. My feet felt softer, like whatever was beneath it had started breathing. My stomach sank. Oh, you've got to be kidding me. The dog yawned. Told you it was Tuesday. Then the city moved. Not a quake. Not a collapse. A shift, like something stretching after a long nap. The streets rippled. Windows shattered. A distant tower lifted itself toward the sky, then twisted sideways. Its glass skin warping like plastic held over an open flame. I swore and took a step back. The asphalt squelched under my boot. I looked at the dog. Suggestions. He blinked up at me. Yeah. Run. So I did. And behind me, the city groaned again, longer this time, deeper, almost amused. Like it had finally noticed I was there. I ran. Not the kind of run where you pace yourself, keep your breath steady, conserve energy. No. This was pure, pants-shitting panic. The kind of sprint where logic takes a back seat to survival, and dignity is left on the curb, waving goodbye. The city wasn't just shifting now, it was unraveling. Buildings shrugged off chunks of themselves. Streetlights bent at stomach-churning angles. The pavement rippled in waves, as if the city itself was having a seizure. The dog stayed ahead of me, because, of course he did. Nothing ever seemed to rattle him. This way, he barked, veering left down an alley. I followed. Skidding on loose gravel, the walls on either side of us groaned, stretching taller. The sky, what little of it I could see, had darkened, the hazy orange bruising into something more sinister. I didn't look back. I could feel the city shifting behind me, feel the weight of it turning over, like some colossal thing deciding whether or not to roll out of bed and kill me. Something slammed shut behind us. A street, a building, a giant, godless esophagus. Didn't matter. The dog took another sharp turn. The alley spat us out onto a street that looked normal. No crumbling facades, no melting steel. Just cracked pavement and empty sidewalks. I skidded to a stop, chest heaving. The dog cut me off. Not yet. The quiet was all wrong. Not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of something watching, considering. I wiped sweat from my forehead. Where the hell are we going? The dog glanced at me, then at the horizon. Away. Helpful. He sat down, staring at something in the distance. I followed his gaze. At the end of the street, the city wasn't just shifting, it was standing up. A jagged silhouette stretched toward the sky. A tangled mess of buildings and streets pulling together into something human-shaped. A torso, an arm, a tilted head of steel and concrete, its hollow windows like staring eyes.